And the second piece of the requirements is that you have to ask a question. And we encourage students to develop their question-asking skills because it's an important skill in life and in research and everywhere else. So there's a reason that we require questions to be asked. We have a lot of students registered in the course this quarter, so there usually will not be time for all of you to ask your question in person. But I encourage you, once Peter finishes speaking today, to raise your hand, and when you ask your question, please say your name because we will be marking you down and giving you credit for that question. If there isn't time, this is absolutely not our preference. We much prefer that you ask the question during the seminar session. But in the rare case that you can't get your question in, you are allowed to email your question again to psuseminar@yahoo.com after the end of the seminar. If you're watching online, you can email your question in during the seminar, and we will ask it for you. We'll be monitoring that email during the seminar. Those of you taking the class for a letter grade need to submit one thing at the end of the term, either a paper or a reflective journal. So with either of those options, you should prepare one single PDF file, not 10 PDF files, and you can submit that to psuseminar@yahoo.com by 5 p.m. on the Tuesday of finals week in June. I think that's June 10th, if I'm not mistaken. Any questions about how the course works? Or how to get credit for the course? Any questions at all? It's all on the syllabus. If you have questions, it's better not to email me or Professor Wong directly with the questions and the attendance and the final papers. It's best to use the PSU Seminar Yahoo address. So no questions. So everyone is perfectly in tune with all the detailed requirements of the course. Okay, so welcome everyone, and I think I'm going to get going with the actual event.
They said they didn't even need that now. The mic up there works effectively.
So I'm going to give Rick the high sign, and actually I was going to sit there.
You're going to sit there?
You're going to sit there? Yeah. Are we ready, Rick?
They're opening a room next door.
Okay.
So if there's extra people.
There's a chair. Could you?
Oh, is that under Sorry, I was just using it.
Yeah. There are people standing in the back, and there are 2 chairs up here. You might. Do you? Well, it's a full room, so we can. Why don't we all move the chair then? You need to share out of space. There's someone who sit here. And I can stand. So we got 2 people can sit here. Okay. Are we ready to start? Okay, we're ready to go. I'm very pleased to introduce Peter Koonce from the City of Portland. He's the Director of Traffic Signals and Lighting for the City of Portland. He's a world-class rock star speaker in the transportation field, and we didn't even have to fly him in from anywhere. He was able to just walk 9 blocks, I think. So we're very happy to have Peter, who's been a very active participant in our education and research programs here at PSU. He's an adjunct faculty member, teaches a course on traffic signals every summer. He also was the founding faculty member of our study abroad course in the Netherlands, Sustainable Transportation. We have 12 students participating in that now for the 3rd year. 3rd or 4th year?
4th year.
4th year.
Yeah.
So Peter also has been a guest speaker in a number of our courses. He's an active partner in many of our research projects, and he recently was honored by ITE with the Van Wagoner Award, which is the best paper in the universe, right? Award.
something like that, yeah.
For a paper that he published in the ITE journal. And so today, Peter has been a leading voice in the nation in basically changing the DNA of our city's streets, and there is a incredibly important need to do that. And so Peter's been leading this reform activity in a lot of ways here in Portland and across the country. So he's going to talk today about his work with the NACTO Urban Street Design Guide. Peter, it's all yours.
Well, thanks, Rob. That's a tough billing to hold up to, but I'll try to do my part to entertain you today, to educate a little bit, and share a little bit about what we have been doing with the NACTO Urban Street Design Guide. I'll go use this presentation as a means to just start that conversation. I want to gauge your interest in what your experience has been in terms of things you've learned at Portland State, and then kind of challenge you in terms of what some of those assumptions are. I think one of the reasons I like to speak at this seminar series is that it makes you ask questions. It starts you on that road as you think about your career to ask questions and to question the authorities, question the assumptions that we've had for so many years. So I'll make sure we leave time at the end for questions. But I do want to start this process for what is NACTO, and then what is the Urban Street Design Guide. So NACTO, well, NACTO it's actually an organization that's been around a long time, but actually before 2010, I really hadn't heard much. I hadn't heard anything about NACTO. Everybody knows AASHTO from the Green Book, the Design Guide. NACTO is the National Association of City Transportation Officials, and it was an organization that was essentially dormant for a while. City transportation officials were working in a lot of various areas. Of course, Institute of Transportation Engineers, as Rob mentioned, is a fantastic organization that city engineers have a chance to share things with other colleagues, county engineers and state DOT engineers. But the nice thing about NACTO as a group is it's really allowing us to facilitate exchange of things that are happening in our cities. And so it's at the very least, it's city staff talking to city staff. It's an opportunity to look at things differently, to think about how we're doing things in cities as opposed to maybe how we're doing things at the federal level or at the state level, or what are unique elements in cities, and specifically big cities. It's a collaboration of a lot of different people in a lot of different cities, and I'll show you an example of that. So how does NACTO fit, though, with these other organizations? Well, I'll start with AASHTO. So for some of you that may not be familiar, AASHTO is the American Association of State Highway Transportation Officials. And so that's your state traffic engineers are obviously involved in that, and other folks at the state level. And the states have done a great job of organizing around AASHTO because they have a history of working together on similar things. If you have a state that has a standard highway design width, highway lane width, then that state may share that with another state. So, of course, all the states are falling in line with AASHTO. We haven't necessarily had that on the city side. So with NACTO, the emergence of NACTO has really reintroduced that. So in Portland, we're learning, if you think about Portland as the context of Oregon, we're not really learning from other big cities in Oregon because we don't really have other big cities. So we can look to, with NACTO, we can look to New York City, we can look to Chicago. We have peers that we can talk to and compare examples of things that we're wanting to do. So specific elements like bike signals are things that I'm working on projects. They're asking me what I'm doing. I'm asking them what they're doing. So we're sharing those sorts of specific examples. It's interesting with NACTO because there's always been this group of county engineers that have gotten together. And that's something that if you go to the other guidelines, not only the AASHTO Green Book, but of course the MUTCD. The MUTCD, the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices, is one where all of these organizations have members that help write that book and vote on the language that goes in those manuals. Actually, the city transportation officials are not represented on that group. So if you think about how we're developing standards and the guidance, it's really been led a lot at the state level, a little bit at the county level, and then at the Institute of Transportation Engineers level as well. So these are the cities that are represented. You'll see a lot of the bigger cities and then some affiliate members, which are smaller cities. This list is not important, but what is important is that it is a good critical mass of cities that are working on similar projects. So again, what I do in Portland is look at other cities, and we have conference calls where we talk about city-to-city relationships, city-to-city things that we can learn from each other. The other thing that's interesting with the Urban Street Design Guide that I'll mention is that there are now 2 states that have endorsed the Urban Street Design Guide. So why would a state endorse an urban street design guide written by cities? Well, in very many states, of course, smaller cities that maybe have a historic main street may want to look to the Urban Street Design Guide as a tool to guide their cities in the way they do design in lower speed settings. And I'll give you some examples of where that comes a problem in some of the traditional documents. So the Urban Street Design Guide covers a wide breadth of information and really is meant to essentially do another look at highway design from taking it from the Green Book, which is looking at the rural and suburban cases in most elements, to the city streetscape. And so there are specific things that we've always used in traffic engineering that are based on that rural and suburban models that are not applicable in cities. So I'll give you some examples of that. I'll start with design controls. One of the things with design controls and how the Urban Street Design Guide is laid out is it talks about design speed, design vehicle, design hour, all these elements that are talked about in the AASHTO Green Book, and puts a real urban spin on them, and really questions some of those assumptions that we've held near and dear to our hearts in a traffic engineering realm. I don't have time to go over every element of the guide, so I've just focused on the ones that are in bold here: design hour, design year, and performance measures. I'll just talk briefly about design speed, though, because design speed, certainly from a perspective of highway design, if you're designing a street or a highway that's a straight line, what is your design speed? What limits how fast you can go? Your vehicle, right? You can go 70, 80, of course in Montana, right? They don't have a speed limit. Whatever's reasonable, whatever you consider a reasonable speed. So that works. Well, that's debatable of whether it works or not. But that's clear that as a designer, you can say that speed is maybe reasonable if there's no one else around. Can you say that in cities? Why can't you say that in cities? Of course, there's a lot of various things. There's more obstacles, is what the Green Book would say. Obstacles being trees, things that are in the way of that design vehicle. So clearly, from a speed standpoint, our needs in cities are much different than what you have in a rural or a much more rural condition. So the first point I want to make, though, is design controls. They should work towards your intended outcome, not against it. So if you think about it from a city standpoint, what's our number one goal in downtown Portland? Our number one goal in downtown Portland is to make it as friendly as possible to pedestrians. But above that, we want housing in downtown Portland. We want people to live and work in downtown Portland. And so if you think about our streets, the nature of our streets, we don't want people to speed through them. We want our design controls to contribute to a safe environment for pedestrians, for everybody that's in downtown. So high-quality design for city streets and intersections relies on a keen understanding of the analytical processes and assumptions underlying those technical decisions that shape our streets. So some of you in the room will know this answer, but what speed do we assume that people drive in downtown Portland? What's that speed? It seems like a good speed. How fast can you drive in downtown Portland? All right, for those of you who took my summer class, you can't answer. 12 miles an hour. Okay, that's close. We're at 13 to 16 miles an hour, actually, in downtown Portland. How do we do that? Well, it's because of the short space between intersections, and we've chosen that speed to make it as safe as possible. If we do have a crash, what we want that crash to do is have as small impact as possible on the people that are involved, whether it be a pedestrian, whether it be a bike, or two vehicles. So we try to manage those speeds as the best we can and try to use signals to do that. So our design controls are really, the assumptions that we've made are really trying to shape our streets to be as safe as possible in downtown Portland, to be as hospitable as possible. We want people downtown. So I'll get into more detail in some of these topics, but I just want to say that this is really a contrast in design styles. The AASHTO Green Book, the geometric design, policy on geometric design of highways and streets, the one on the right, would not suggest 12 miles an hour as an appropriate design speed. in the NACTO Urban Street Design Guide, we start to talk about what signals can do and what things we want to do in downtown settings. So design year, let's talk about that. That's the big picture design year. What is our planning horizon? What's our planning horizon for most highway projects? Do we look at designing for tomorrow? Do we look at design for next year? 20 years out, okay? 20 years out. So specific guidance right from the AASHTO Green Book. Many highway engineers believe the maximum design period is in the range of 15 to 25 years. So as I started my career, I worked in the travel demand model, looked at the forecast, looked at historic growth, estimated the growth in a straight line estimate based on historic growth, and what did I get? Oftentimes, I'd get a doubling of traffic. A doubling of traffic. Okay? So to accommodate that, you have to make the streets twice as wide, typically. Okay? In downtown Portland, if you look at the travel demand model, we don't have that same level of growth. So what's good in the rural or suburban cases that happened between 1970 and 2000 when I started my career, or thereabouts, is not what's happening today. And so the trend is different today, and that's what the Urban Street Design Guide talks about. So we have to think about these straight line growths a little bit differently, perhaps. Maybe look at the actual data and change the historical perspectives on that straight line growth. Perhaps that straight line growth isn't going to hold in the next 20 years. So doing a careful consideration of what is it that we want our cities to look like, and how much traffic, how much vehicular traffic do we want to try to accommodate or encourage in our cities. So that's a really important point. And this is data from the Sightline Institute, where they had a specific project where they kept updating those forecasts. They updated it 3 times on the length of the project, and that's what you see in those straight lines. Each time, those updates were straight line estimates. And that's a very, very typical thing for engineers to do, is to consider a straight line growth based on historic patterns. Now, what's happening is that trend is going downward, so you have to rethink that historic trend pattern. So why is it that we're doing this? Well, we have an unconstrained growth. We've always wanted to try to accommodate that vehicle demand. We have to perhaps rethink that, go away from that straight line growth projection, and then think about the underlying goals. Are we just trying to do congestion reduction, or are we trying to be more careful with how we invest in our transportation system and think about how we use perhaps congestion in some ways as a policy, so that we encourage people to use public transit, to walk, to change where they're living. Those sorts of things are bigger picture questions that may or may not be appropriate for the city that you're working in. But here's a good example, Barber Boulevard, where we're out in southwest Portland, and this was essentially the way in which we, as engineers, treated the street. Barber Boulevard is on this left-hand side here. And essentially, this curb is essentially planned for accommodating that future traffic growth, perhaps an off-ramp in the future, perhaps making it a more mobility-focused facility. But certainly, if you think about that today, and Metro and the City of Portland and others in ODOT are working on a plan to figure out how do we rethink what this corridor is doing for the neighborhoods that are on the corridor. How do we use transit more effectively? How do we create a more functional walking space than what's there today? So that trend in Portland is happening on projects, but you see that trend happening slowly because certainly we only do that every 20 or 30 years on corridors like Barber Boulevard. Okay, so we looked at the big picture design year. I want to shift to the design hour. So that's more in my realm as the signals and street lighting manager. I have to think about things on how it's working on a day-to-day basis, whether I need to make changes to the traffic signals, whether I need to think about whether we can accommodate or provide enough green time for the particular movements, and who I'm providing that time for. Our common practice, and this isn't the AASHTO Green Book, this really comes from the Highway Capacity Manual, is to look at the peak 15 minutes of the entire day of traffic. So we look at vehicular traffic mostly, because that's on Powell Boulevard here as the example. That's what we see most people traveling as on Powell Boulevard. So Powell Boulevard really is indicative of any suburban sort of arterial where it's mobility-centric. In this case, one of the few in Portland that are 6 lanes wide and moving a lot of traffic. So we study the peak 15 minutes in the highway capacity mail as a way to determine whether we can accommodate traffic and make the delay for people that are using the facility as low as possible. And the AASHTO Green Book talks about urban design as being the 30th highest hour. So considering the 30th highest hour, the representation of a daily peak hour. If you think about the 30th highest hour, well, let's start with the peak 15 minutes. If you think of the peak 15 minutes, what percentage of the day are we designing for? And do some quick math, 24 hours in the day, 4 15-minute periods. That's like less, okay, a little more, than 1%. 1% of the day we're designing for. In what other line of business do we design for the peak 1% of a day? And then if you apply the peak, the 30th highest hour of the year on top of that, that's even taking it further to designing to a small percentage of the time that we would have on the street. So that's something that we've always done. We've always looked at it from that perspective. The NACTO Urban Street Design Guide thinks about this differently. It says, look, we can't design for that peak 15 minutes. Or maybe we don't want to everywhere. Maybe we want to think about multiple hours of the day. And think about, okay, you're going to have some periods of congestion. Maybe you have an hour that's bad. That's kind of life in the big city. 15 minutes, it's going to be congested. But an hour, that's okay. So not to worry about that. And then think about the other times of the day. So streets designed for peak intervals of traffic, those 15-minute periods, may fail to provide a safe and attractive environment during other portions of the day. So that's really key. It's thinking more broadly about the city and the street and how it functions throughout the entire day, a 24-hour existence of the street, as opposed to just trying to accommodate that peak 15 minutes of traffic. Quite a different look on it. And so the Urban Street Design Guide talks about what are the typical needs from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. So 8 a.m. you may be focused on mobility. You may want to be thinking about transit first. You may be wanting to think about moving cars. But at noon, maybe it's an accessibility focused. You'll see that in downtown Portland. I'll get you some examples if I have time. But then at 8 p.m., when the city is maybe quieter from a traffic standpoint, thinking about other needs. And that's something that as a signal engineer, we never really did before. We always just worried about the peak hour. We came up with traffic signal timing plans based on that peak hour, and we didn't really spend a lot of time on those other times of day. So intersection design principles. So getting into the details, intersection design principles, we got to think about streets again differently. And how do you do that? Well, we kind of have a six-point program for doing that. We want intersections that are as compact as possible. That example I showed you on Barber Boulevard, that was not a compact intersection. That was a very sweeping right turn, not the safest environment for pedestrians. We want to analyze systems, not intersections. I'll give you an example of that. Time and space, that's, of course, my realm with traffic signals. Thinking about intersections as shared spaces, utilize excess space effectively, and then design for the future. So systems, not intersections, is really very important to me, and I'll get into the performance measures of why that is. But certainly, if you think about this particular intersection, if I look at this, just this traffic signal, and I'm doing my level best with all the green time that's there, maybe I don't have enough time to spare with everyone there. It shouldn't necessarily mean that I've failed. We've got to think about the system as a little more broadly, and perhaps there's just other directions, other spots that they can use in the system. And that goes to just not only the system as opposed to one mode, thinking about it from a vehicle standpoint, but also thinking about it from a pedestrian standpoint as well, or a bike standpoint. Maybe this street is a good one for bikes, that we would want to accommodate that mode of traffic and make that as comfortable as possible. So integrating time and space, that's where the signals, the AASHTO Green Book talks about balancing needs and functions of different time periods. Again, streets designed for peak intervals may fail to provide a safe and attractive environment. We've got to think about those things differently. Okay, last but not least, performance measures. What performance measures are we using in cities to try to guide our decisions in terms of investments? everybody can recognize this as a failure. This is Skagit River Bridge. This is an example of where the bridge had a crash that resulted in a failed section of the bridge. And as engineers in the room, certainly that's clear to everybody. Transportation is a little more subjective, and again, it depends on your community. And I presented on this in my last seminar here at Portland State. I talked about confessions of a traffic engineer, and one of the confessions is that our mode, our measure, our primary measure for identifying whether we've succeeded or not is just seconds of delay per vehicle. Okay? If I was judged in my job solely on seconds of delay per vehicle, I'd be failing all over the place. Downtown Portland cannot accommodate more cars than it already has. So what is the measure that would be right for downtown Portland? Well, thinking about it broadly, it's thinking about people, not just cars. So person delay as opposed to just vehicle delay. And so we've done that with transit, obviously moving people by bus, moving people by train, and prioritizing trains as they go through the city. In Portland, we've thought about this a lot over time. It's not just the work that I'm doing, but a lot of us at PBOT trying to figure out what is that right measure. And actually, some of that's been recognized in the work of others. And so I'll just highlight this work that's been done by Roger Geller and Greg Raisman and others at the city over the many years that they've been working on tracking bicycle traffic, thinking about crashes, and then showing this downward trend as we've gotten more people to ride over the bridges, we've gotten a safety in numbers essentially effect where the crash rate has effectively gone down, which is really great news. It's really getting more people into downtown. So from an economic development standpoint, we're really doing our job as transportation professionals to make the city more vibrant, make the city work better. And that's represented in this Guide to Sustainable Transportation Performance Measures that was co-produced by the EPA and Federal Highway Administration. This is a real live example of that in Northwest Portland. Northwest Broadway, as you come over the Broadway Bridge, okay? It's a great example picture from Jonathan Moss, Bike Portland. But this is our AM peak hour. Okay? And if you look at that picture, if you think about it by mode, how many cars do you see in that picture? 9. Okay? How many bikes do you see in that picture? It's over 20. Right, so if you're trying to get people into downtown, if that's that measure, right now we've provided about 6 or 7 feet for the bike lane, and we're providing 24 feet for cars. So we're getting to that point where it's, gosh, am I going to be able to, is the signal going to fail for cars? Do I have 80 seconds of delay for cars there? No, so I'm doing my job right? I'm winning. Okay, no, but that's not the right metric. I need to think about people delay. And luckily on this picture, I think everybody got through the signal, including all the bikes in the line. So thinking about it from a performance measure by mode, but then also you can aggregate that up, of course, to people delay. New York City has done some really great work on this topic, thinking about performance measures a little bit differently. And they've been, as they've done streetscape projects, they've considered a broad range of measures that I've never thought about as an engineer. So that's why cities talking to cities is really fantastic. And one of their measures was just speed decreased. How much did speed decrease on the street? And then the top speed, thinking about crashes that happen, injury crashes falling. That's fantastic information to have. The other thing that they've done is get information about commercial vacancies and then also polling. They've done a lot of polling to figure out, do people like what we've done? Are they willing to pay for that? Are they seeing more sales along the corridor where they do these sorts of improvements? And it's really fantastic to see new measures being used by engineers and planners alike. So the takeaway from all this, I hope that you'll take away, is trying to apply the Urban Street Design Guide. I want you to think about the challenge. I want you to challenge those assumptions. Is the question that we're asking the right one? Person delay versus vehicle delay? Or should it be economic development or other things? And all those things roll down to engineering details that we apply as practitioners. And then going up one more level, of course, to the planning forecast. Thinking about it broadly in terms of what are we trying to accommodate? What's our future going to look like? So use policies to change transportation traditional practices. So with that, I will thank you for your time, and I'll open it up to questions. Yeah.
Just looking at that photo of the bicycle, with the City Club's report that came out last year about saying that the design, they need to start designing, the city needs to start designing more appropriately for bikes. Was this taken into account, or was this already underway, all of this report, what you've done here with the NACTO thing? Was that before the City Club report, or did the City Club report play any impact in this?
No, really two parallel processes. The NACTO was done at the national level, led by some of our, the New York City DOT has been a great sponsor of NACTO, so they've been really driving a lot of that process. But other cities like Boston, Chicago are really been good voices for making this transition happen, making us think more broadly and bring some of those design details into a format, a written format that you can leaf through. I should say that the Urban Street Design Guide is available in bookstores and Island Press, or also online. So you can, I'd say 95% of the Urban Street Design Guide is freely available just by clicking through the NACTO website. So if you Google Urban Street Design Guide, you'll find all of what I've talked about and more in the online format.
When the design guide gets updated in the future, what should it include, or is it perfect? Is it there right now?
That's the big picture research question, right? More research is always necessary. Clearly, there's more detail that can be put to it. We really scratched the surface on. Well, I'll just talk about my expertise is in traffic signals. I think there's a total of about 6 pages on traffic signals. We really scratched the surface. We didn't talk a lot about transit. We could certainly talk more about transit, but the NACTO, the design guide really reflects kind of the most pressing issues. So it's not comprehensive at all, but certainly, and if you looked at that NACTO list, the member list, it's cities. And not many cities, unlike Canada, not many U.S. cities run transit. But certainly in Portland, we operate the Portland streetcar. So if you think about it from a financial standpoint, one of our priorities as a city in terms of having dollars go out the door is transit operations. So wouldn't a smart city figure out how to make the streetcar faster and reduce the costs? So that's certainly something that we could do a lot better job with is documenting best practices for transit. Yeah.
I saw that you had that list for the cities that are within NACTO, and I was curious, do you see a trend of smaller cities trying to communicate with NACTO itself for like upcoming development for their cities? Like say it's a smaller town and they're going to try to do some urban expansion and contact to see if some of the larger cities have some guidelines or some type of guidance for them to develop their city's infrastructure just so they don't run into the problems that some of the larger cities have had in the past.
Yeah, sure. I think the Urban Street Design Guide represents that first point of contact. So I think anytime you can write things down, you can start to share that information right off the bat. But clearly this filled a niche. There were several documents that we pulled from to really make this happen. A lot of state DOTs that had similar documents. State of Maryland, I worked in Maryland quite a bit as a consultant. They had a Main Street handbook essentially that was written by the DOT. So there's a lot of DOT work that's similar to this. This may be the Urban Street Design Guide, the one additional added value perhaps of many, I guess. But one added value is that it's really focused on bigger cities. It talks a lot about various things, but it's really written to focus on some of the big picture issues, some of the emerging techniques that I tried to just scratch the surface of. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about the max design period and your unconstrained growth that sort of was the trend in the past and how our actual trend is kind of decreasing and not really meeting it. When you're planning for your bike and your transit things, are you also still kind of thinking about it in terms of unconstrained growth? Or are you still assuming that there's going to be this accommodation for cars and other things as they continue to decrease?
Well, that's a great question. I think one of the challenges that we have is the modeling. We have very sophisticated tools for modeling auto trips. Bike modeling, bicycle transportation modeling is not as well not as well documented, not as well demonstrated in the industry. Portland State's done some fantastic research in that area. It's something that we really need to do a lot more on to try to forecast what will happen in the future given the different facilities. But to answer your question directly, we think about all those various things, and we have to be very cognizant that as we think about designing for the future, it's, what is it, the known knowns and the unknown knowns? So to borrow from Rumsfeld, if I could, there's a lot we don't know, and so that makes it hard to talk with certainty about whether this bike improvement will get us to the goals that we've set forward. What we try to do in this case is just work with the community and try to make each project meet the goals, not only of the community but of the broader whole. So we have to think about the community input, and that's really what's been driving a lot of what we've been doing at the city. And in traffic signals, I am very responsive to complaints. So that's something that if I get complaints from somebody that's trying to cross the street and hit the push button and they're saying, why am I waiting here for 2 minutes? Well, I'm going to answer that question. But if I get complaints from just people in their cars, I'm going to do my level best to meet their needs as well. So I encourage you, as you're a transportation user, to call in and interface with your city, because if you're of course, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, if you will. All right, one more. Yes.
So I was wondering, are you familiar with the South Waterfront bicycle signal?
Yeah, I might have been involved in that a little bit.
I was wondering if you have plans to increase the bicycle signals like that throughout the city.
And if you're a student and you're asking a question, you can say your name.
Kenzie. Thank you.
Sure. That bicycle signal down the South Waterfront, the small 4-inch display, is something that is a NACTO topic. You'd think that wouldn't be necessarily a topic that we would talk about, but those details is what that's the first one in the U.S. That's built that way. Actually, when I suggested that 4-inch signal, my city staff, my colleagues at city staff said, "Oh, that'll never work. What are you doing there? That'll get broken. That's going to get torn off. That you shouldn't put it at that small level." And I said, "Well, let's try it. Let's just try it. Let's just see what happens." And that it's worked extremely well. We've now gone to a version 2 that has on Rosa Parks and Interstate 5 that's a little bit better. It's a little more sophisticated. It's a more stout model. So that we have now 2 intersections with those small bike signals, and we really design those so that it'd just be more intuitive. The current standard for bike signals says that the signal should be at a height that's really very high out of context with a bike, with bike travel. And so this smaller signal, which is doesn't meet any standard, any federal standard, is at that human level. So we've implemented that. Other cities are interested in how we did that, how we got our maintenance staff to stock those and to respond to those. And my answer to that, one of my favorite stories, is my staff work very well with me and trying to figure out if what I'm doing is off base or whether it's in line with what we can do. And they said, well, yeah, we have an issue. We don't have a place to put that on the shelves. So I said well, if we have a problem, we can just put them underneath my desk because they're smaller. I'll just hold them right there. I'll be the maintenance yard, if you will. So you can come to me if you have another question. But those signals, we will expand their use. We think they're providing information to cyclists that provide better information than what we've been able to do in the past. Yeah.
My first name is Alicia, last name Holloway. You kind of mentioned briefly near the end. My first question, though, I'm here to ask a couple of quick ones. Are you going to have this available someplace in PowerPoint so we can review the slides?
Yeah, I think the slides will be available. If not, the video will be archived.
Okay. Oh, of the whole process? Okay, but that would be helpful if possible to have a link to that. And then you said something about, obviously getting feedback about like people's experience with this, bike riders, vehicle drivers, etc. What could you say about the feedback that you've been getting? Because I mean, obviously you don't want to, you're making it safe for them to utilize their bikes or walk, and you're not using them to just specifically manage the vehicle. I understand what you're saying in terms of like size and odds, but what is the feedback that you've been getting in regards to that? And are people basically obviously probably driving slower, but maybe not as many coming down the area because they don't want to deal with all the additional obstacles, or what's sort of the feedback?
No, great question. If you spend time looking at traffic like I do, I mean, we constantly are monitoring what's happening on the street, and I think you can go to the Hawthorne Bridge at any at the peak hour, and you're seeing that there's just too many cars to. I mean, we have more than enough vehicle demand, certainly, and so that's something that we don't think we're. It's not discouraging people from driving. Certainly, we have more demand than we can ever handle. That's not been a problem. And if you look at bridge counts over time, the vehicle traffic is really stable because we're at capacity most hours, and so that's something that we feel like we have a stable amount of people coming in and out via car. It's just trying to create more people downtown, trying to get more ways to do that. And if you don't have money for a brand new bridge that can provide that input, or you don't want to pay for the expense of a parking structure, the best way to do that is to use your infrastructure more efficiently. And the way we've been seeing the most success, of course, is by having people walk and bike more, and of course transit as well. So you can move a lot of people, of course, with trains, and that's certainly Max is a good example of that, where it's been very successful in getting people to downtown and moving people and having a more vibrant city. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you were working with traffic signals. What is the criteria for planning, an effective one? You may have already answered this question.
Well, I think that's changing. Oh, yeah. Sure. I mean, when I started my career, the sole criteria was vehicle delay. So when I started, it was just to make sure we had enough lanes, and then to make it as efficient as possible from a vehicle delay standpoint. That's changing now as we think about rebuilding our traffic signals. I want to make sure that the traffic signal is accessible. That's the number one thing. I want to make sure it's safe. Well, that may actually say I said those in reverse. Safety is number one. Accessibility is number two, and then there's the mobility function. So when I think about safety, I think about making sure that all the standards are met that they can realistically meet, that people can see the display, that they can understand what I'm trying to achieve. Then I think about accessibility. I think about pedestrians being able to navigate and understand where they need to be, including members of the blind community. And that's a huge deal for us, and there's added expense associated with that, but that's a big deal to make sure that our signals are accessible for all members of our community. And then, of course, if I think about it from a transit standpoint, I want to try to provide a little benefit for transit. We've done some things even for trucks, where we want to try to provide a benefit for trucks depending on where the signal is. So on Columbia Boulevard, we have a project where we're going to try to be as good as we can for freight and try to make sure that we reduce the stops of heavy trucks. And why do I want to do that? Why do I want to make it as good as I can for trucks? Well, guess what? The other part of the equation for the city, and my boss cares a lot about pavement. He's a city engineer, and of course, if you've read the Oregonian, you know that that's a subject of a lot of discussion, is how bad the pavement is. If I can use the signal to reduce the wear and tear on the pavement, I'm going to do that. So I hope I gave you a few insights to the various modes and all the things that I'm thinking about as I think about a new signal. Yeah.
So you mentioned before that I'm Joe, by the way. You mentioned before that Washington and Massachusetts had adopted the Urban Street Design Guide. Do you think that as more entities kind of adopt it, that it'll kind of leak into more of the federal type books, like the new TCD I've heard is very vague on bike traffic and stuff. So do you think that might leak into more uniform like signals and signs and stuff for?
I'd say the Urban Street Design Guide is less so than the Urban Bikeway Design Guide. So the Urban Bikeway Design Guide was the first NACTO publication that really was more focused on traffic control around bike infrastructure. The Urban Street Design Guide is more of the Green Book, which really, if it's the AASHTO Green Book, so state highway document, funded in part by USDOT, but it's really not it's a policy document, not necessarily the standard document. So states build their standards off of that, but the Urban Street Design Guide has that sort of same flavor where it's not necessarily a standards document, but it will, I think, influence some of those other elements that are guiding the decision processes that we make.
To what extent is NACTO official policy within PBOT? And as a follow-on, how much pushback do you get from the state without them having adopted NACTO as an official standard?
Great question. So our director, Leah Treat, she was very quick to say, look, this represents the best practices of all these cities. We want to endorse it. And so she signed on to that endorsement and really supports its use. Follows the city council incorporating the Urban Bikeway Design Guide by ordinance, I believe. So really, we're on board, and I think that's something that with the Urban Street Design Guide, it's a high level document. It doesn't really talk too much about what thou shalt do. There's actually some pretty controversial statements about what the maximum design speed is for a facility. By endorsing it, doesn't mean we change everything overnight. We don't, as much as we'd love to see it, some of the speed limit signs don't just change, magically. We have to have time to make those things happen, and we have state policies of setting speed limits that we have to work through as well. So it's an important step, and the leadership at PBOT has really embraced it. But there's a lot of work to be done to work into where do we go from next, and how does ODOT change, or how does ODOT policy embrace it? And so that's a big question that we have as we move forward, is where are these conflicts coming up on projects, and how do we get through them? Yeah.
In terms of the NACTO membership, I'm kind of curious about what constitutes a member as opposed to an associate. Affiliate city?
Maybe say your name.
They're Kinsey.
Yeah. So NACTO, I'm not. I think the difference is just the amount of level of participation. There's a membership fee for the cities, which gets you access to a wide variety of things. And webinars is one of those things that NACTO's done a great job. One of the last webinars that I attended was fantastic was freight issues in New York City. Talk about your double parking. I mean, there are things that happen in New York City that we just get a very small taste of in Portland, and so we're learning from them about what's best practices for making freight delivery zones work, and that's really helpful for us.
So how do member cities? Some of those cities are experiencing really rapid growth, and some of them are experiencing slower growth and decline.
Absolutely.
How is that reconciled within the process? When you're setting guidelines about traffic patterns and so forth that are growth dependent, how does the group kind of work that out or reconcile it?
Well, I mean, we're not all driven by growth. I mean, some of that it just depends on the. I mean, whenever I should say the article that I got the award for, co-written by NACTO staff and New York City DOT staff, was really focused on development. So thinking about if new development is coming in. And whether that's new development, or redevelopment of an existing building, it's an opportunity to think about the street differently. What used to be a 50-mile-an-hour street could change if you have the right design principles, given that the land use and density is appropriate, right? If it's a and you see this in South Waterfront, right? South Waterfront right next to McAdam and I-5. I-5 is not going to change. McAdam may over time, given that we're putting more signals in than we had before. Of course, then if you get closer to the water, we want to make sure the traffic is ever calmer as you get into the neighborhoods and get onto people's front doors. So thinking about things in terms of how you accommodate, whether it be growth or redevelopment, or really any transportation project, it's an opportunity to rethink some of our traditional practices. You've got to put a speed limit sign up. You've got to mark the street. All those things are opportunities when you have transportation dollars and an opportunity to reinvest in the existing infrastructure. Yeah.
My name is Nathan Rochester, and I'm wondering, you described NACTO as officials connecting with officials, and you mentioned polling of community members to see just how effective this speed planning is in meeting their needs. I'm wondering to what extent NACTO has led to increased connectivity between officials and community members and improved methods for actually accessing an equitable representation of community members.
I'd say NACTO hasn't really led the former. The first part of your question was officials to the public. I think we're just learning from each other. So I think that those sorts of lessons learned are ingrained in that. If we see a city that has had success in that regard, we'll just we mimic that to the extent possible. The topic of equity is one that's really very important in Portland. It's important in other communities, but certainly we have it's an emerging topic. If you think about from a transportation, my career, equity really only came into the discussion about 3 or 4 years ago. So if you think about all this history and research that we've done on quantifying vehicle delay and now this new term of equity, well, gosh, I don't have all the answers around that. But certainly it's something that we're actively pursuing. What does that mean for our transportation projects? How does that play a role? And that's something that we need to do a lot better job with. I think we've had incremental steps. My hope is that we'll have a monumental step in the next 2 years, 3 years, as we think about what transportation means to our communities, and equity is a huge part of that. And you see that in the city government. We have an Office of Equity. I think that's 3 years. I mean, that's something that, again, the city is committing resources to that. Yeah.
My name is Chris McDowell. You mentioned that the average speed in Portland for city roads is about 15 to 16. Do you know, roughly, is that on par with other cities of the same size, or kind of where is it?
Sure. I say that 15 to 16, it's really a function of the signals. So speeds will be higher in some cases if you turn the corner, if you came late to the green. That's our design in terms of progressing traffic through the downtown. Now on the east side, like MLK and Grand, the signals progress for 30 miles an hour. We've had some discussions of whether that area is changing, whether that should be a different speed than what it is. And you see that, you may have seen that. We've done that on Everett and Gleason, east and west. In fact, a Portland State grad, now working at the city, retimed those signals to consider 18 miles an hour as the speed, as opposed to what was traditionally a 30-mile-an-hour street. As you started to see street cafes and things happening on Northwest Everett and Grand, we said, well, why don't we revisit the signal timing so we can try to manage those speeds a little better and reduce some of the peak of the peak speeds. So those are factors that are coming to play in some of those elements of how we're rethinking that. We want the speeds to be manageable, and I think that's one of the things that we're striving towards, is figuring out where that fits. Where are we in the right spot in these various corridors? Yeah.
So I'm Danny Mercer. When you're talking about the shift in focus from vehicle delay to people delay, are any economic impacts taken into account? Because obviously cars and bikes and pedestrians all cost different amounts of money for the users and to the city.
Yeah, I mean, the primary in all those calculations, the primary element is value of time, and the value of time really typically exceeds the cost of the vehicle. So depending on where you put that economic element is, that's really key. And the other part of that, actually the flip side of that, from a public cost standpoint, is all those things are dwarfed by a bus, right? So if you think about it from a transit standpoint, the cost of the driver, very expensive. The cost of all the time of people on that bus, huge. So, and then freight. Freight is really hard to discern. We don't know where the freight is. We don't know. We're doing some work on Columbia Boulevard where we've detected length of vehicle, so we know that it's a long vehicle. So we're now saying is that freight? Maybe, probably. Should we be prioritizing longer vehicles at signals? That's what we're doing right now. That's the best we can do until everybody has a chip in their head and we can, get that information off of them and what they're driving and what, but that may be coming with connected vehicles. If the car or the vehicle could talk to my traffic signal and had better information, I could do a better job. But right now, we're doing the best we can with all that. But that's a great question for the future is how do we get better information about that? I think I have time for maybe one more. Yeah.
You said that like 5 years ago you'd never really even heard of NACTO and they didn't do as much. Was there like a driving force or something that got them to be more active and start making all these guides?
Boy, that's a great question. I don't know if I know the answer, but I would say New York City DOT, maybe it was the leadership of Michael Bloomberg and Jeanette Sada-Khan, the New York City DOT commissioner. I think that was the first time I'd heard is just the work they're doing, remaking streets, kind of rethinking New York City, jumping into bike infrastructure in a big way, thinking about transit lanes. So I think I'd say New York is somewhat the nexus, and they've done a tremendous job of documenting what they've done and really getting more involved in transportation investment. I think we've been fortunate in Portland. We've had a long history. I've only been at the city for 4 years, and the signal speed setting was not something I did. It's something that was here long before I got here. I just inherited a system that's been really well designed, and I try to manage it and operate it the way it's been, and try to make it just an incremental step level better. And we've been very fortunate to have transit investments, and of course the bike program's been active for a long time. So part of me thinks I'm resting on the laurels a little bit, and then I'm also, I guess, just trying to keep us moving in the right direction. Great question. Rob, any parting words or thoughts?
We still have 3 minutes.
Oh, 3 minutes? Oh, great.
What can we say?
As a signal timing engineer, I want to make sure you're on time here. It can't be.
There was an online question that gets to how do, so there's a lot you can do in practice, but what is the role and what is the opportunity for changing policies and regulations at different levels of government? Because there may be things at the governmental decision-maker level that need to change. So what are a couple examples of those?
Well, I think, the biggest example that I'm involved in is the Manual of Uniform Traffic Control Devices. And I think there's, what I'd say for all of you is you start your career, once you get out in your career, you'll be given tasks and really have a chance to jump into design projects. But it's that opportunity when you can stop yourself and on the design project and kind of question that, why is it this way? And then maybe ask the question of your boss or maybe your boss's boss, or just keep asking the questions and then volunteer to get involved in various activities. And that's one of the things that, one of the things I'm trying to lead and push for is bike signals. And it's like, well, why have we done it? Why don't we have those small bike signals that they have in Europe? They have them everywhere in Europe. Why can't that work in Portland? Why can't that work in the U.S.? No reason for it. We've just never done it that way. There's a lot of people that will tell you no, and a lot of people will tell you can't do it that way. It's not our standard. You just have to keep pushing forward and say, well, let's try it. Why don't we just try it? FHWA has a great process for experimental review, so they'll help you along, or, well, maybe not help you along, but at least check in with you and figure out how you need to direct your analysis. And again, partnering with the university so you can study things to the level of detail that really moves us forward and document it via research.
Well, before we thank Peter, I want to thank all of you and remind you to be here next Friday at noon, where we'll have Ian Carlton, who's a postdoctoral researcher at UC Berkeley, talking about transit planning practice in the age of transit-oriented development. So we look forward to that, and let's thank Peter for his great presentation.
Thanks, Rob.
Bike signals.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. All right.